Well, what's up again there, guys? Brian here, D3, Topics Gamer, here to share for one of my top list videos to share with you guys today. Now, to continue on the trend of kind of sharing my top 10 or top 5 or just top whatever lists of favorite PlayStation games from certain generations, I figured, let's continue on with the trend and let's go back to the very first PlayStation with the original PlayStation. Unfortunately, I don't have 10 games, so I had to go with 5, simply because I have to admit, during that period of time, I wasn't really the biggest PlayStation fan. My brother was. He was one who introduced me to PlayStation, but during that time I was more of an N64 kind of fan, and I've already done a list for that. So these are just going to be my top 5 favorite PlayStation 1 games of all time. So if you do happen to enjoy this list by the end, please do not forget to like, share, and subscribe. Keep track of me on my future videos. And remember, if you guys have any ideas for future top list videos, worst to best videos, or just reviews, or just discussion videos in general, please let me know in the comments down below, and I will try to get it as soon as I can, as well as to make sure I give you a solid shout out at the very beginning of the video. So let's start off with what I would consider to be my 5th favorite PlayStation game of all time, in the form of YuGiOh Forbidden Memories. Now, I was a big, and I could say in some ways still am, a pretty big fan of YuGiOh. And during the early years, there wasn't really any one particular way to play the game. If you were playing outside of the traditional card game, there were multiple variations of the game that were playing the game in different kind of ways, and Forbidden Memories was really one of the earliest versions of this game. It has some story elements from the actual manga that was out at the time. I don't think the anime was out. I think we were still a number of years away, so this actually came out around the time I was just starting to get into YuGiOh. Now, I do think that there is a great deal of variety in terms of how you can approach this game, because the rules are a little bit different, but it is a good way to kind of understand unique different strategies, because there's several ways you can kind of go through this game with a variety of different cards. I think the card library is pretty solid. I think that the music is actually pretty good to even hold up to this day. I would really like to see if they could do like an updated version. I'm not sure if this is a game that ever needs to be released, but it is a game that I do see a lot of older vintage gamers going back and playing and just trying to find unique ways of playing the game. I just think why it stands out the most is that it's much like other YuGiOh games. As I stated earlier, it manages to actually take a lot of the primary concepts of YuGiOh, but just kind of switch it in a unique way to give it its own kind of style. And that's something I always really appreciate about YuGiOh, because there's multiple different ways you can play the game even now, as it's in a constant state of evolution. And I always appreciated YuGiOh games when they didn't actually have to necessarily play the same way as the typical card game, but managed to do things in its own unique way. And I do know for a fact that Forbidden Memories was very successful in doing that, which is why it's number 5 on my list. Going into number 4 is going to have to go to Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Now, I gotta admit, this is actually one of the very few Castlevania games I've actually played. I think out of all of them, I've only played like 3 or 4 of them. But this one was very, very unique for its particular style, because a lot of people call it kind of Metroidvania, because it pretty much took the typical style of a Metroid game, but gave it a Castlevania kind of paint job. But I don't necessarily think that's entirely true, because this also incorporated a lot of key RPG elements. And as some of you will come to see by the future entries of this list, RPG elements in games can actually make things a lot more interesting. Now, I also like that there's a lot of kind of secret elements with Symphony of the Night, as story-wise, to be fair. You pretty much start with playing as Richter, who fights Dracula, and then after their battle, you then take control of Alucard, who is Dracula's son, who has to go into the castle in order to find out what exactly happened to Richter and then defeat Dracula. There's definitely a number of key moments. There isn't really too much in terms of actual plot as you progress through the game, but it can be quite challenging, and just figuring out exactly where to go and how to get there and how to progress, and even certain secret elements of this game make it a real serious challenge. And I gotta admit, this is something that I kind of enjoy a little bit more than ever Metroid, because I'm not even the biggest Metroid fan when it was in the original style, because I know Metroid is a completely different type of game nowadays, but in the original days, that's kind of how it was. And I do think that Castlevania was probably the closest I ever got to actually becoming a fan of Metroid or something of its style, because I do know that from that point on, a lot of Castlevania games followed that particular style moving forward until we get to some of the later games that have come out in, not necessarily recent years, but like the more recently released Castlevania games, which are done in a much more action-adventure style. So because of that, I really did appreciate playing it, and I had a lot of fun playing it on a number of occasions, so that's why I have to say it's number 4 on my list. Now, going into number 3, we now enter my all-time favorite JRPG franchise of all time in the form of Final Fantasy. Now, taking the number 3 spot is going to have to go to a game that I think gets a lot of disrespect, but I personally don't understand because this is still one of my all-time favorite Final Fantasy games of all time in the form of Final Fantasy VIII. This came out not long after Final Fantasy VII came out, and it actually made some pretty solid improvements in just about every single department outside of story. Now, some people think that the story is completely garbage, and I have to disagree with them on that, because there's definitely a number of really cool story elements involving the crew of Squall and his members of the Seed branch, which pretty much is this kind of advanced fighting force in order to take on Source's Adea, or Adea, or however you want to pronounce it. I really did like the change from the comp system between 8 and 7. I like the Guardian Force abilities, or technically the functions. I really enjoyed the special little card game that the game got you. I love the map design. I love the artistic direction that they took. I love the music. The music has easily some of the best music in Final Fantasy history, without a doubt. And I would even say it's probably one of the more challenging Final Fantasy games. Now, the thing that I really loved about Final Fantasy VIII is that it kind of always adapted to your level. For a long time, areas in certain places throughout Final Fantasy games were always kind of locked to a specific level. But the thing about Final Fantasy VIII is that as you leveled up, the enemies variety would level up too. So if you actually chose not to level up your characters, the game would adapt to that too. That way, the game was never too hard or too difficult. It was never too easy, never too hard. It was always kind of balanced. And that's something that a lot of games don't actually take into account. Some people like to just kind of push the game really quickly. Some people like to take their time and level grind. And heck, and if you level grind, the enemy got tougher too. So that's a function that I thought was really, really great and something that a lot of people don't really give this game a lot of credit for. But I will, which is why Final Fantasy VIII is going to have to take the number 3 spot on my list. Taking the number 2 spot on my list is going to have to go to the very first entry that I ever actually experienced myself and my personal favorite video game franchise of all time in the form of Metal Gear Solid. And so, obviously, that has to go to the very first Metal Gear Solid game. Now, you have to remember, this wasn't the first Metal Gear game. This was Metal Gear Solid. There were a couple or a few more entries, depending on who you talk to, that came out before this came out. But for a lot of people I've spoken to, this was actually their introduction into Metal Gear, and it was also mine as well. Now, this pretty much follows the story of Solid Snake, who is a retired member of the advanced unit known as Foxhound, who has to infiltrate into a secret base called Shadow Moses in order to stop a group of terrorists from using a very dangerous weapon known as Metal Gear, which is pretty much defined as a bipedal tank. A tank that can actually kind of walk, it can move, and it can also fire nuclear payload, so that is, anytime you involve nuclear weapons, it's a pretty solid deal. Now, this was out of the creative mind of Hideo Kojima, who's an absolute genius and my favorite video game director of all time, and this was also one of the greatest stealth games at the time. A lot of action games kind of typically want you to focus on just going around and killing everything, but Metal Gear didn't do that. Back in the older days, it kind of encourage you to kind of go through the game and not kill anybody, and heck, Metal Gear Solid very much tried to continue that tradition. Now, there's so many incredible elements of Metal Gear that you could do a whole list of your own, just focusing on the great things about this game. It had great characters. It had great voice acting. Voice acting was not very big during this period, especially in PlayStation. Not a lot of games were doing it, or I should say were doing it incredibly well. And heck, a lot of people still talk about that to this day. The music was absolutely fantastic. The boss fights were great. The combat, the style, the camera angles, everything about this game was actually pretty revolutionary at the time, and a lot of those elements were continued on in the franchise. I would say at least a good 2 or 3 more games after this game came out that I really appreciated. Now, I really love it, but I don't love it as much as a few other entries. I think just the only thing back is that despite the gameplay style being kind of advanced at its time, it still kind of feels a little bit outdated compared to future elements, but that's not a bad thing. But heck, yeah, this is the game that really did start a lot of people's enjoyment of the franchise, and it did the same thing for me, which is why it's number 2 on my list. Going on to number 1, I have to say I've spoken about this game on numerous occasions, but this is quite literally the single most important video game that I have ever played, and it's easily one of the most popular PlayStation games of all time. In fact, a lot of people don't even remember this, but this was also a release title in the form of Final Fantasy VII. Yes, probably the most well-known entry in the entire history of Final Fantasy. And yeah, this version, the real Final Fantasy VII, not whatever that crap is that they released recently and it's getting a sequel sometime later next year, but I'm not going to talk about that. But this is the single most important video game I've ever played. And the reason is because this game established my personal love for not just RPGs but also JRPGs, and it also made me a story-driven gamer. If it wasn't for this particular game, my entire path as a gamer probably wouldn't even be where it is today. I probably might not be even into PlayStation. Who knows? I could be an Xbox gamer. Not saying that that's a bad thing, but let's just say Xbox gamers are have a much different taste in video games than people who prefer PlayStation. This also made me enjoy story more. This is perhaps the reason why I'm a story-driven gamer and not just into multiplayer games. I would say for a number of reasons. Now, there are so many incredible things about Final Fantasy, like it's the music, the characters, the story, the visuals at the time, which at the time were pretty impressive at the time, even though nowadays it looks kind of really, really old school. But there's just so many incredible facets of Final Fantasy VII, which makes it a legendary game. And in a lot of cases, some of their most favorite Final Fantasy games. I mean, there's just so many incredible moments that happen throughout this game, like, the opening bombing mission. Then there's, what happens to Aerith. And then Sephiroth is still one of the most iconic Final Fantasy villains of all time. He's not my personal favorite, who has probably one of the most creepiest and most badass themes in video game history. I mean, there's just so many things about Final Fantasy VII, which is why it still holds top because of its importance, not only on this list in the PlayStation, starting my real journey of PlayStation, but my journey as a gamer. I mean, trust me, I was a gamer a little bit before discovering Final Fantasy VII, but I didn't take it quite as seriously until I got this game. I can literally say this is really one of the very few games that really did change the course of my life. And I mean that with the most sincerest honesty, which is why I had no choice but to place it as my number one favorite PlayStation 1 game of all time. So now that my list has now been officially shared to all of you guys, I would like to know if you guys enjoyed playing the PlayStation 1 or did have your own. What are your favorite PlayStation games of all time? Let me know in the comments down below. And like always, thank you guys for watching. You're awesome, and I'll see you next time.